Hi everyone.
Juneteenth is the oldest known U.S. celebration of the end of slavery. And in celebrating Juneteenth, the Suffolk Public Library would like to introduce well known local historian, author, and poet, Mr. Nathan Richardson.
Mr. Richardson will share the history of Juneteenth and read an excerpt of the Emancipation Proclamation. Please help us celebrate Juneteenth by sharing your comments, videos, poetry, memories in the comments below. And tell us what Juneteenth means to you. Introducing Mr. Richardson.
Hello, my name is Nathan Richardson, and I am a native of Suffolk, Virginia. I'm a poet, an author, and I do living history portrayals of Frederick Douglass. And I've been invited by the Suffolk Library System to record this short history of the anniversary of the celebration of the holiday Juneteenth. Now, Juneteenth, of course, is the date in which slavery finally ended in America. And so during this short time, it's about 25 minutes or so, we'll be not only talking about the history of Juneteenth, but we'll be talking about how it evolved and so forth. Of course, anytime you're talking about the end of something, you wouldn't be telling a complete story if you didn't talk about the beginning. And so we'll be talking about how slavery started in America as well. We'll be reading a few excerpts from the Emancipation Proclamation and then talking about the progression of Juneteenth and how it is now swelled to a substantial celebration of American history. So American history, for that matter, the Juneteenth holiday, is a commemoration of the end of slavery in America. While most of Americans know the narrative as being the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery when it was issued by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, the underlying story is that that news of the Emancipation Proclamation did not arrive in Texas, the southernmost state in the Confederacy, until 1865. And so Juneteenth, June the 19th of 1865, is the event we are celebrating when we say we're celebrating Juneteenth. And so the telling of that history, of course, starts with the beginning of slavery in America. Now, slavery in America started around the year 1619. And we just recently had a big 400-year celebration of the first Africans landing in America. What happened there is that a ship called the White Lion commandeered a Portuguese ship, took that cargo, the living cargo, human cargo, and rerouted it from Mexico to a place near here called Port Comfort. Now, Port Comfort is known as now as Fort Monroe in the city of Hampton, Virginia. And so you can actually visit Hampton, Virginia and Fort Monroe and the Casemate Museum and learn more specifically about that history. Now, for what happened when that ship arrived at Port Comfort is that that cargo was disseminated, and those 19 Africans, and they were Africans, they were not slaves when they boarded those ships in Africa, they were put into bondage. And when they arrived at Port Comfort, they were moved on to the interior of Virginia in colonies like Jamestown and Williamsburg. And those people were put into slavery, and some of them became indentured servants. And there's no record of any of them ever achieving their freedom. As a matter of fact, they are the first 19 of millions of Africans, mostly Africans, who would become slaves in America. Now, For another 250 years after 1619, the country used slaves to further its good, to build the country. They used those people as slaves as a means of manual labor, free labor. And for 250 years, there were people in America who were opposed to slavery. And they had an abolitionist attitude and fought for the abolition of slavery. As a matter of fact, some of the more famous ones you might be familiar with, William Lord Garrison, who was a great abolitionist and led the Garrisonian era. The Quakers were certainly a religious sect of society who greatly supported the abolition of slavery. They actually teamed together with African Americans like Frederick Douglass, who I portray in Living History, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and many, many others teamed together especially in the 19th century, for the abolition of slavery. And they somewhat influenced the country to come to a reckoning of itself that slavery had to end. And the Civil War was the final decision event that would decide the fate of slavery and whether it would continue in America in a social, legal, and economic sense. I mean, the entire country was absorbed with this brutal and unfortunate institution. So what we're looking at here as far as the end of slavery is that the Civil War, of course, started in 1861 with the first shots fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, and that began the actual armed conflict of the Civil War. It pitted Americans against themselves. The South, states in the South, seceded from the Union, and they started an armed rebellion. And of course, this lasted until 1865 and the surrender of General Lee. And almost 800,000 or more than 800,000 Americans were killed in that war. Now, there are three major things that contributed to the end of the war. These things helped end the Civil War and emancipate the slaves. The first of which, by the way, was another event right here in Virginia at Fort Monroe, which is basically the same place that it began in 1619, that General Butler, who was the man who was running Fort Monroe, wrote an edict, which was later adopted by Abraham Lincoln, saying that slaves or Africans who ran away from slavery were able to come to Fort Monroe and claim themselves or turn themselves as contraband of the war, and that the North would harbor them and protect them. And so that started a migration of many Africans running away from their masters and making their way to Fort Monroe. And there are many throughout our history. Martha Ann Fields from Matthews County was one woman who left Matthews County with 7 children and walked to Fort Monroe and claimed herself as contraband. Her children went on to become noted people. 2 of her sons, one went to Hampton University, the other to another institution, and one became a lawyer and the other became a state representative after Reconstruction. So you see, this history is very, very rich. And so the final thing, of course, was, the next thing was that Abraham Lincoln, under the influence of Frederick Douglass and others, the generals, some of the generals around him, was convinced that all of these hundreds of thousands of colored people who had came to Fort Monroe and were still, abroad in the North, should be used in the fight in the Civil War. They would add troops to fight Henceforth, they had only been used to carry supplies, fetch water, and things like that. But to give them actual arms and to let them fight was a monumental step for Abraham Lincoln to take, and it was a monumental step that eventually created a strategic and a literal advantage on the battlefield that basically overwhelmed the Confederates. Now, that, of course, by itself was not enough. Abraham Lincoln, over much delay and thinking and deliberation, drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. And so that document basically freed the slaves and set the stage for the real end of the Civil War. We're going to read a little bit from the Emancipation Proclamation in just a little bit. But we do want to talk about the fact that this Emancipation Proclamation, which was delivered in January 1st of 1863, which reached all over the North and part of the South, was met with jubilation and a great skepticism, because people were saying after they read it that it probably didn't mean that slaves were free. Some of them interpreted it that way. Now, the reason that the Emancipation Proclamation did not arrive in Galveston, there's a number of theories. Number one, that the messenger who was taking the word of the Emancipation Proclamation was killed, and he didn't make it down there. The real reason, the most historical reason with evidence, is that it didn't reach Galveston, the southernmost state in the Confederacy, because there were not enough Union troops in Texas to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. And so it wasn't until June the 19th of 1865 that General Gordon Granger, and his troops actually arrived in Galveston, Texas, and they read what was called General Order 3, which announced the Emancipation Proclamation. So let's read General Order number 3. This was a military order introducing the state of Texas to the emancipation of enslaved people in that state. And it read, and this is an excerpt from the beginning, it reads as such: "The people of Texas are informed, and in accordance with the proclamation of the Executive of the United States, all states are free. This involves the absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the communication heretofore existing between them becomes now between employer and hired labor." So it says they're no longer slaves. They cannot work for free. They should be paid. Of course, and then they handed out, disseminated copies of the Emancipation Proclamation. And they let them know that General Lee has now surrendered and the war is over. And so there was much fanfare. Many of the former slaves in Texas decided to leave Texas. It was not an easy decision because you have people who all they have known in their lifetime is the master and slaves, the slave society. And so it was very hard for some of them to even reckon with the thought of leaving a plantation, leaving their homes, so to speak, and going. But many of them did, and many of them moved to surrounding states that might have been more accommodable to colored people. Now, of course, this Emancipation Proclamation, and I'm quite happy to have a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation on my wall right behind me here. I was given that by the Navy. I did a Black History event for them about 6-7 years ago, and they gave me a framed copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, so that's on my wall. So I'm just going to read here an excerpt of the Emancipation Proclamation, and we'll talk very briefly about how this impacted. Of course, Abraham Lincoln was very cautious in how he entered the Civil War. He didn't mention too much about slavery as being the reason. As a matter of fact, he stated his primary reason was to save the Union, and he proceeded in that manner. But the war grinded on for years, and thousands upon thousands of Americans dying, and it eventually became a fact that slavery was the primary, the very top of the list of states' rights that the South was demanding. And so it was an unavoidable reason for why we were fighting the Civil War. And clearly there were many who supported the Union but did not support the end of slavery. There were people fighting for the Union who actually owned slaves. And so this is where the genius of Abraham Lincoln came into bear, that he drafted a document that would find a coalition of people that would allow him to free slaves, but at the same time maintain the forces necessary to win the war. And so this is the first part of the proclamation. A proclamation. Whereas on the 22nd day of September in the year of our Lord, 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following, to wit: that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforth and forever free. And the executive government and the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons, or any of them, in any efforts they make for their actual freedom. And so, Abraham Lincoln is opening up this Emancipation Proclamation by making it very clear his intent to free enslaved people. Now, what he did next was the brilliance. And that was because there were people, there were farmers, slaveholders, masters on the side of the Union. He diced it up. He was very specific about who had to give up their slaves in this 100-day period and who did not. And so it says here, now, therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do on this first day of January in the year of our Lord, 863, and in accordance with the purposes to do so publicly proclaim for all the period thereof 100 days, for the day first mentioned above, order and designate as states and parts of states wherein the people thereof respectively are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following, to wit: Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Clemens, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James Ascension, Assumption, Terrebonne, La Fourche, St. Mary, St. Martin, and Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the counties of Accomack, Berkeley, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and which accepted parts are, for the present, left precisely as if this proclamation had not been issued. So you're seeing that Abraham Lincoln is giving a pass for 100 days to those slaveholders who are fighting on the side of the Union. He's saying that by the time this war is over, you will also have to give up your slaves. You will have to divest yourself of this institution. And so this is how we are getting to the final proclamation that will end this entire travesty in America. Colonel Gordon Granger, with his regiment, went down to Galveston, Texas, read the third general order, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and now we have Juneteenth. Now, Juneteenth, of course, over the past 150 years, has certainly had its high points and low points. And we are right now what would be considered a high point with an asterisk, so to speak, because unfortunately we can't get out as we normally do with this pandemic and this quarantine and celebrate in person the Juneteenth holiday. But over the years, Juneteenth has been celebrated during Reconstruction. It was celebrated and hailed. After Reconstruction, of course, there was a down period because after Reconstruction, when many in the South were able to regain power and the Jim Crow laws and such forced many of those people who had gained some position, those colored people, and were able to openly have businesses and celebrate their own holidays and rituals and customs, that they had to go and go into hiding in some cases. And so for that period of time, Juneteenth was just an event that was held mostly in rural communities, by riversides and things like that, where small groups of people got together and celebrated this Emancipation Proclamation arriving in Galveston, Texas. Now, of course, during the 60s, during the Civil Rights era, a resurgence of the Juneteenth holiday occurred in which African Americans were able to go back in the Sankofa fashion and reclaim their history and talk about it and celebrate it and commemorate the things that have happened and our contributions to American society. And so with that, Juneteenth has continued to become more and more a part of American society as we have more representation in society, in public office, in politics. We are able to have influence on what is decided about how we will be celebrating the history of America and what is read and understood about American history. And so we have the Juneteenth. Now, I wouldn't be remiss if in talking about Juneteenth and how Juneteenth has affected America, talk about how Juneteenth was brought here to this community of Hampton Roads, there's always the first. And in this case, not a lot of people knew about Juneteenth until a lady by the name of Miss Sherry Bailey brought Juneteenth to Hampton Roads, Virginia, and she actually brought it right here to Suffolk to start. She, for a number of years, held a Juneteenth celebration at events or venues throughout the city of Suffolk. One was one of the parks right here in Suffolk, Virginia, in which every June she would hold a Juneteenth celebration and have music and food and talk about the history. And so she is really the person, and she's still doing it today. 20, 30 years later, talking about the Juneteenth. And every Juneteenth, she is part of some celebration somewhere. Although, the seed that she planted has become vast. People have picked up the torch from her. It's a little fire, and they hold their own Juneteenth torch. And so Suffolk is doing their own thing. Newport News has 2, 3 events. People all over the community of Hampton Roads, Virginia, are celebrating Juneteenth. And for that matter, people all over the United States are understanding the real narrative of Juneteenth, and that although the Emancipation Proclamation on April 1st of 1863 set the stage, it was not until General Gordon Granger and his regiment arrived in Galveston, Texas on June the 19th of 1865 that the last slaves, the last people in bondage, were freed from slavery. So that's the story of Juneteenth. And thank you for joining me during this little pandemic going on, and just talking about the history, keeping history alive. And hopefully you all will want to take part in whatever else the city of Suffolk and the library system have for you. They're going to be using the technology available to invite you all to come in and contribute to the celebration with your poems, with your speeches, with what you know of the history. Anything you can contribute to the telling of this history is going to be appreciated and welcomed by the city of Suffolk. I think it's a grand thing that even in my lifetime, and I grew up here in Suffolk as a boy, am proud that the city of Suffolk tells the complete narrative. Thank you. I'm Nathan Richardson. Have a great day. Stay safe.